Are you ready to go?
It's all yours.
All right, cool. Well, good morning, everybody, from a hotel room in Phoenix, Arizona. This is your president, Phil, K7PIA, and welcome to the June 2022 meeting of the Mike and Key Amateur Radio Club. And we'll begin today's meeting with our presentation. And for that, I'll turn it over to our activities manager.
Hello. All right, well, he's setting up the presentation. So because it's so close to field day, I wasn't. Okay. Yeah, since it's so close to field day, we weren't able to find a volunteer to do a presentation this month, so I wound up doing it again. So, sorry about that you got to watch another one from me. But, we would love for people to volunteer and put something together if you've got something interesting you want to do and share with the club. This month's presentation is going to be on my learning journey through the Learning CW through the Long Island CW Club and how they teach CW to the world. Wait, is it going?
Yeah, you'll use the roller ball on the mic to go forward and back.
Okay. All right, so this is my intro screen, and that's my actual shack right there. And I've got my three keys sitting up right there. The first one on the left is a cootie, which is a side swiper that has absolutely no help at all in terms of creating the spacing and timing between the different bits and DAWs and characters and stuff like that. It's the hardest of the keys to use, but it's also my favorite. The one in the middle is my straight key, which is a Bengali blade. It's based on the Swedish pump design, and it's got a wonderful feeling for sending code with the straight key. I absolutely love that key. And then the one on the right is my Vibraplex Bug, which has been highly modified. It's got some extra weight on it and something called a Verispeed, which lets me control the speed of the DITs. So what a Bug does is it's the DAWs are manual, but if you push that lever to the right, it makes DAWs, but the DITs are automatic and it's mechanical. So it's got a pendulum that's spring-loaded that'll create DITs, and the Verispeed lets me control how fast the DITs run. So I can go from about 30 words per minute down to 10 back and forth. Okay, so well, first of all, too, what is the Long Island CW Club? So that is a huge ham club based on New York that exists to continue the CW operating and take people from beginners all the way to absolute experts and everything in between. It's approximately 3,000 members right now, and it's experiencing, I would say, almost exponential growth. Members are all over the world, and what they do is they run courses that start around 6 a.m. Eastern time and run until about 9 p.m. Pacific over Zoom with various CW experts that will teach you from the very beginning when you're first learning your first character all the way to absolute, rocking speeds and stuff like that. They also have some really fascinating presentations that they give, but they're all CW focused. So like one great presentation they did a while back was the NSA's director of the Cryptography Museum, where she was talking about how during the Civil War the Morse code was encrypted on both sides and how the encryption was broken and stuff like that. It was an amazing talk. That one wasn't radio focused, but it was still CW. So. Okay, so for people new to CW, it stands for continuous wave, which was a name that beckoned all the way back to spark gap transmitters when they became obsolete. So spark gap transmitters were our first early transmitters that Marconi created. They used a high voltage spark across a gap to produce a damped radio wave. And so CW was essentially the point where we started to have continuous sine waves rather than a burst of a damped wave that was transmitting. And the spark gap transmitters took huge amounts of bandwidth and caused all kinds of interference, and they're not really legal anymore. So individual characters for CW are made up of DITs and DAWs with short spaces between them. A DIT is a short pulse, a DAW is a long pulse, and words are separated by a slightly longer period of silence. There's several Morse code standards that have different mappings between the DITs and the DAWs, but the one that we see used most common is called ITU, or International Morse Code, and that's a partial mapping of it there on the right side. There are some other standards, including the older American Standard, Continental, and Japanese. And some of the people in the CW Club are really interested in some of those alternate mappings and focus a lot on that. So operating CW consists of two distinct user actions, which is copying, or listening to CW transmissions and interpreting their messages, and sending, which is transmitting a CW message using a key. And there is a distinction between the word key and keyer there. So a key is a switch that when on creates a tone and when off doesn't. And a keyer is an electronic device that can automatically produce bits and DAWs as you hold the keys down. And I have some examples of those up here up front that I'll show a little later. So becoming proficient to copying in CW is very similar to learning to read, like we all did when we were kids. So you know, when children begin to read, they first learn the alphabet and the corresponding sounds. And okay, so yeah, when kids first start to learn to read, they learn the alphabet first and the sounds that correspond to each character. Then they start to read words by sounding out individual characters. Eventually, they're able to read the entire words without thinking. So they hear the word and they recognize the entire word without having to think what the individual characters they were seeing were. And eventually, the brain starts to build up speed by developing advanced mental techniques around pattern matching. And so, one example of that is when we're reading, we focus on the first and last character, and there's less weight to the middle characters. And I've got an example down there at the bottom of a highly misspelled phrase of words, which says, "This is why we can read things like this easily," even though every word in that sentence except is completely misspelled or backwards, or words are transcribed. It's really just the first and last character that we pay the most attention to. Is everything okay, Jason?
Yeah, no,
Okay. Okay, so the goal of when you learn to copy, the goal at first is what we call ICR, instant character recognition. So that's the immediate recognition of specific characters without conscious thought. And so when you're first learning this, it's a pattern matching exercise where you want your brain to immediately identify the character it's hearing when it hears the pattern. So when you hear da, you know that's A without thinking. You don't have to stop for a second and go, okay, that was a dit and a da, so it's an A. It's kind of like learning speech too. It's actually both mental pathways. Eventually, though, as you continue to work on this, you'll start to develop instant word recognition, or IWR, and that's the immediate recognition of entire words or patterns. So anytime you see something, you hear something commonly hear common phrases while you're operating CW, you'll start to recognize entire words or entire phrases. So for instance, when you get the RST report, you'll hear 599, and that 599 will just jump out to you like it's an entire word. You won't have to think that it's 5 nines. Or anything like that. And eventually, you'll develop what's called head copy, which is the ability to understand Morse code without writing down the words of the characters. So when you first start, you're going to be writing down individual characters as it goes, but eventually you'll be able to do it just in your head, and that's really important for building speed. So the technique that Long Island CW Club teaches is to begin by developing ICR for the alphanumerical characters in a subset of the punctuation, which is period, comma, question mark, and slash. Those are the ones that are commonly used in QSOs. They work towards ICR and start building higher speeds. And most people start to top out between 15 and 20 words per minute with ICR, so right around 20. Most conversational CW occurs between 15 and 20, but contests tend to go significantly faster. You know, above 30 words per minute is actually fairly common, but those are typically predefined exchanges, and it's really just the important information that people are looking to pull out of that. So in a contest exchange, it might be somebody's name and an RST, which is almost always 5 nines in a contest exchange, and possibly a location or something similar to that. So the 30 words per minute, a lot of times people aren't actually pulling out every character, every word. They're just getting the important information in context, which is what we do when we listen to speech or when we read too. So there are several different definitions of speed when looking at CW. So the speed of CW is affected by the relative spacings of dits and DAWs, the spacing between individual characters, and the spacing between words. And varying the speed is used during the learning process. So which speed should we vary to maximize learning? Traditionally, throughout the ARRL's program for teaching people CW for the code-based tests, they would actually vary the speed of the dits and the das. So they would slow down the dits and the das and put spacing between them for the various speeds that they were targeting for the test, which was 17, 13, and 20, right? For those who actually did the code-based test, those were the right speeds, right? Okay, so at any rate, so what instead of if you looked at an individual character, like let's say an X, da, 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 right? They'd slow that down. The dits and the das would be way so da, dit, dit, da, rather than listening to the same speed that you would hear like during a QS, like a real QSO or something like that. So that can cause issues when you're learning. And the way that most of these modern clubs actually teach it is using something called Farnsworth spacing instead. So instead of slowing down the dits and the das, they send the dits and the das at full 20 words per minute, but they add more spacing between individual characters so that you have enough time to think about what you saw. So what that does is change what's called the effective speed. So you're hearing the patterns at the full 20 words per minute, but you've got more time between either each character or each word, depending on which one you're actually focusing on, whether it's ICR or ICW. The reason that this is done this way is it teaches you to recognize those patterns at full speed rather than having to learn the patterns at slower speeds and then speed them back up. And this tends to, for most people, this tends to make it much easier to learn the patterns and to learn to do conversational QSO, but it also makes it easier to slow down. It's much easier to slow down than it is to speed up. So if you need to slow down during a QSO, having learned it with Farnsworth at 20 words per minute, you can slow down to 7 and still do okay. There is a point actually though where if you are talking to someone whose dits and das are exceptionally slow, if you've learned it at these speeds, you may actually struggle with that. And for me it was right around 7 is the point, 7 full words per minute, where the dits and the das are actually slowed down to that point where I have trouble copying them because I'm used to doing it at 20. So their recommended ICR progression is to start learning the character set at a full 20 words per minute character speed, adding enough spacing between the characters to drop the effective speed down to 7 words per minute. So every character is coming in at 20, but there's enough space that you can actually have a second, approximately a half second or whatever, to think about what that character is that you're hearing as you're copying. As that starts to become easier and easier, they increase the effective speed by reducing the thinking time between each character. So the progression that's typically used at LICW is 7, 10, 12, 15, 17, and then 20 for the ICR portion of this. This talks a little bit about mental pathways, which I already mentioned. So there are a lot of statistical regularities in our environment that the brain uses them to shortcut processing in similar future situations. The primary principle is that the brain extracts coarse gist information rapidly and then uses it to generate predictions that help interpret the input. It continuously employs memory of past experiences to interpret the sensory information and predict immediate relevant future. So copying CW invokes both the auditory and the reading comprehension mental pathways. It's different than speech and it's different than reading, because in this speech, when we listen to speech, we're listening to syllables coming in at high rates of speed, and our brains recognize those patterns as words. They're not thinking about individual characters as they come through. When we're reading, we actually do the same thing by what I showed earlier, where you interpret the word by seeing the first and last character and the relative length, and we don't pay nearly as much attention to the middle. So with CW, as it starts to speed up, your brain starts to do the same thing, and that's how you actually start to get past approximately 20 words per minute and get yourself into instant word recognition. The closest parallel is listening to a word spoken very slow. Oh, sorry. The shortcuts used in CW are different than what we use for those. And the interesting thing there is that in CW, you're always hearing each individual character. You're not hearing a syllable and you're not hearing a whole word. You're seeing the characters come through, but your brain actually starts to anticipate what's coming next. And so the parallel to that is listening to a spoken word very quickly. So if I say something like supercalifragilistic, right, you know what's coming. You know what that word's going to be. And the same thing starts to happen with instant word recognition, where as you see the characters flowing in, you're able to anticipate what the next character is going to be based on the context and your previous experience. And eventually you're able to pick up entire words without thinking about the individual characters at all. Now, the next part of CW is sending, and LICW recommends that you learn to send each character while you're learning to copy them. So the belief here is that learning to send will ingrain the patterns in your mind and help you learn to copy. There is a field of thought, though, that this is actually more difficult because you may not actually know what the characters are really supposed to sound like. And so by sending too early, you may actually confuse yourself in the copying because you may develop patterns in your own sending, or you may have like irregularities in your own sending that you'll pick up in your copying. For me, this wasn't the case. I found that once I started to send, my learning accelerated significantly. So how do you get started learning to send? Well, you need a key and something to produce a tone. So I have a couple of examples here on the desk. I have a couple of practice oscillators and a keyer, which is the electronic device that'll make dits and das automatically. So let me pull those up for a second. So this is an electronic keyer, and I've got it attached to an iambic key here, and then I also have a straight key and a straight key oscillator here, which was the Boy Scout design that uses a 555 and some really weak filtering and creates a pretty harsh tone. But learning to send requires some way of doing that, and your radio likely has keyers built into it too. Now, when you're sending, each person has an individual fist or sound of their sending. So there's variables that include the dit to da length ratio, spacing between dits and das, and swinging individual tones. The goal of sending is to be easily understood, not to have perfect spacing. But there are some people that strive for absolute perfection, and I'm going to show a tool a little later that can help with that. And that picture on the right is actually the Titanic's radio operator. So here's how LICW actually recommends that you practice. So their recommendation is 2 or so 10 to 15-minute practice sessions a few times a day. Don't exceed this length. It's not considered productive, and you won't be learning anything if you go past that. For sending, they recommend that you record yourself sending and then try to copy it back. That'll let various flaws show up. Now, if you're actually a member of LICW, they have a buddy program where you can pair up with an experienced CW operator, and they'll listen to your fist and give you feedback. You could do this with anyone, though, of course, too. And there is a lot of software that'll try to teach sending by automatically copying what you're sending, but it's finicky and inaccurate, especially if you have an inaccurate fist. So one of the really cool pieces of software doesn't actually try to interpret your fist, but what it does is show you a graphical representation of the lengths of the dits and the das and the spacing, and compares it to what's considered an ideal fist, and lets you basically see where you can improve to be heard better, be understood better. So that leads us to tools for learning. Sorry, this font is so small. The first one is G4FON, which was written by Silent Key, G4FON. He created a well-known Windows application for learning CW, and it follows the Koch method, which I meant to talk about earlier. The Koch method is essentially that you use the Farnsworth spacing to learn a pair of characters, and after you've mastered those 2 characters, you add 2 more, and then 2 more, and 2 more, and you continue that until you've mastered the alphabet. That's actually, when I was talking about the practice sessions, that's the way that they teach it in LICW as well. So G4FON starts out with that, but once you've learned the characters, it can also do QSO practice, and then it can do common words and common phrases and things like that for starting to learn for instant word recognition and stuff like that. There's also quite a few like Android and iPhone apps and stuff that give you games for CW. So Morse Mania and Morse Mentor are 2 of the really common ones. These are really great for if you just have a few minutes and you're sitting there with your phone and you've got some time to do it. But the downside to these is that they give you a software keyboard at the bottom, and you start to recognize the pattern to the position of your finger rather than the actual character that you're copying. So they are effective, but I would highly recommend mixing in actual copying where you're either writing down the letters or trying to head copy rather than focusing on that position-based model. Now, PC fist check, that's a typo. It's PCW fist check. That's the software package I was talking about where it will show you a graphical form of your dits and DAWs and let you see what what they consider the perfect dit to DAW ratio is, which follows something called the Paris method, although I don't go into that in this deck. But it basically lets you detect spacing issues and see like if you're swinging individual dits and DAWs, and they have a whole lot of examples of common mistakes. Like one of the really common mistakes is if your character ends in a DAW, a lot of times someone will hold that DAW longer than the other DAWs, dits and DAWs, and things like that. And I'm going to show that here in a second. And then the Morcerino, which is a standalone piece of hardware that has an oscillator built in. It can try to interpret your CW if you connect a key to it or you use its built-in paddles, and it can send CW for copying practice. I have one of these that I built from a kit, and it was a lot of fun to build it, but I never use it. It really wasn't an effective learning tool, at least for me. So I was gonna show this on the screen, but I'm just gonna have to hold it up to the camera instead. Oops. Okay, how close do I need to get?
People in the back aren't going to be able to see it.
Yeah.
I don't know how you can bother.
Well, okay. Well, here, this image right here is PCW fist check, and the green is their ideal representation for the letter D, and the red is what somebody actually input on their key. So they recorded that using their sound card, and it's showing them that their DAWs are slightly long and their spacing is a little bit longer than it should be, is what that's showing. And then here are some examples of common flaws. So this is showing that the speed doesn't actually match up where it should be. The dit to DAW ratio isn't exactly correct. Here's another one where the dits are super short and the DAW is about the length it should be. This is a staccato fist, which is just like any musician will talk about staccato, which is where you take a longer note and you cut it into a shorter length, but you still hold the full length of the rhythm. So this one is the dits are too short, and it's kind of dit, 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 instead of dit, 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 dit. And then here's an example of the emphasis on the last DAW, where that last DAW is longer than it should be. And then the other tool I was going to show was actually pull up G4 FON. So I have it running there, and one of the gotchas with this is when you first install it, it's set up for the Koch method learning with only 2 characters. In order to get the full functionality, you need to increase the number of characters above 20. Well, once you've done that, it's got a bunch of built-in files where it can do things like execute QSOs for you and things like that. So you pull up a QSO file, and it'll randomly select one. And when I click on it, oops, I got this muted. So you can imagine when you're using this, you could be sitting there copying these characters down, and there is a delay between it sending the character and you actually seeing it on the screen, so you can have a chance to actually write it down. And right now I have it set to 20 words per minute with 20 words per minute effective speed, so there's no Farnsworth spacing enabled right now. If I stop this and I select the effective speed to say 10 words per minute, it's still going to run at the 20 words per minute character speed, but the spacing will be slower. So now there's a space between each character. It always starts off with 2 sets of 3 Vs. That's what it's doing there. So same speed, but there's much more time to think about what's going on between each character. Okay, and then once you start to learn the characters and stuff, get on the air and try to copy real operators, and you'll find that this is much harder than copying computer-generated code. There's band conditions; it'll fade in and out. There'll be some interference. People's fists will get in the way, where you start to see those flaws in their fists and have to learn to adapt to them. But this is actually a really great way to start to learn to copy real world code. You can also tune into the W1AW code practice bulletins that the ARRL sends out. What they do is they'll send text from recent QST magazine articles sent at various speeds. They don't use Farnsworth spacing for these. So if it tells you that it's 7 words per minute, it's full 7 words per minute. So da, dit, 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 da. But slowing down to that once you've reached 10 to 15 words per minute, Farnsworth would actually be really easy. I've listed the frequencies that they broadcast on down here at the bottom with 7.04 and 140475 highlighted, but you can see that they basically cover all the bands. And their operating schedule is available here at this link. Okay, and then keys. How do you select a key? So LICW recommends that you start with a straight key. This is my Bengali blade, which is the Swedish pump, and this is an amazing key. If you have the money and you're willing to spend it, I would highly recommend that for your first key. If you just dipping your toe in, there's a lot less expensive straight keys. Like I have one from CW Morris here. The biggest difference between this and that is, of course, that's beautiful and it's gold plated and everything, but this one has a hard stop. When you click it down on the switch, you can really feel that you're hitting that hard connector at the end of that. That one, on the other hand, has some give to it. And it, for me, it feels really smooth. Some people dislike that. Some people prefer a hard stop. I really, really love that softness in the straight key. I already pointed these out, but these are the rest of my keys. So this is my W1SFR Fat Boy Cootie. So W1SFR hand makes these, and they're wonderful cooties. A cootie has a soft landing on both sides, and there's nothing helping you in terms of producing the dits and the DAWs. It's basically you've got a switch to the left and a switch to the right, and you have to rotate your hand to produce the dits and the DAWs. It feels a lot more like playing a musical instrument than it does turning a switch off and on. Already covered the Bengali blade, and I already went into some detail on my Vibraflex bug, but the bug is super satisfying. By default, out of the factory, that will run the dits at 25 words per minute, and you won't be able to slow them down past that. But like I said, there's things you can do to modify it to be able to slow down. And it's just when you've been sending a whole bunch and you're starting to get a little tired, it's wonderful to just be able to click that push that to the right, and have it just sit there and spill out the dits. And watching the mechanics work is super fun too. It's an amazing mechanical device. Here's some other types of keys. These are the ones that I don't use, although I do have an example of one down here. These are paddles. This one is a single blade paddle, and the difference between a cootie and a single blade paddle is whether or not it has a soft or hard landing in most cases. This one will have a hard landing, so you move it to the right and it'll go beep, and you move it to the left and it'll go beep. But if you can either do like you do with a cootie, where you rotate your wrist, or you can plug it into an electronic keyer, and it will automatically produce the dits and the DAWs as you hold the keys down. The next one on the lower right is a double paddle, double blade paddle, and that has two separate paddles. When you push the right one in, it's going to make a DAW, and when you push the left one in, it's going to make dits. And as you hold them, it'll make strings of those. And if it's an iambic paddle or an iambic keyer, when you pinch them together, it'll make an alternating string of dits and DAWs. So sorry, we're having some technical difficulties here. There we go. All right, so I'm pushing the right one in. That's a string of DAWs. The left one, string of dits, and then I'm going to pinch it. Now, the double-bladed paddle with a keyer is really, and a single-bladed paddle with a keyer is not recommended for beginners because it doesn't give you a feel for that rhythm, and that's what kind of drills those patterns into your brain as you're also learning to copy. But the double-bladed paddle is probably the most popular with contest operators. These two here are both pretty cheap. I think these were under $50 a piece, both for that straight key and for that paddle. But I prefer these nicer Bengalis and stuff like that, because that's pretty much all I do is CW at this point. I already talked about these two here from CW Morse. These are really inexpensive but pretty high quality keys. kind of targeted at beginners, but people do use them all the way through. And these are actually the exact keys I have sitting up here in the front. Okay, so once you've learned that character set and the numbers and the couple of punctuation that you need for a QSO, you also kind of need to learn the pro signs and Q codes. So these are shorthands that are used to shorten the communication, but also to enable international communication across language boundaries, because these are standardized even if you are someone in another country. So the Q codes are three-letter acronyms that denote larger concepts, which most of us are already familiar with: QSO, QTH, QSL, etc. The list that's actually used isn't all that long. So those aren't too intimidating. And then there's some abbreviations and prosigns, which stands for procedure codes. These are shorthand to signal standardized communication. And I have a couple of examples down below. K is used for over, which is da da da. It's the letter K. AR run together, so it's two separate characters. AR, that's actually a prosign, but it's run together and sent as a single sequence. Da 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 da. That's AR, which is out, and how you would end your communication. And then DE, that's another example. That's French for of or from, and that one is not a prosign. It's sent as two separate characters, and you hear that a lot during CQ or any response where you're sending call signs. It'll be, your call sign or their call sign, and then you'll send DE for from, and then your call sign. So dotted it. Okay, so once you can copy between 7 and 10 words per minute, you know a few of the common pro signs and Q codes, you can have a QSO. It took me a month and a half. When I was learning CW, I had my first QSO approximately a month and a half in. Most of the exchanges are fairly standardized, and it's just like any voice exchange, right? You're going to start off talking about your name, your location, you give you an RST report and stuff like that. I used the standard LICW exchange for my first one, and it turned out I was talking to an LICW student, and so it worked out perfectly. There are some frequency ranges that are commonly used by beginners and also have experienced operators ready to respond and to CQ calls and willing to work with beginners. So the two frequencies that I listed here are some of the SKCC recommended frequencies, which is another CW organization that focuses on any manually operated CW. It stands for Straight Key Century Club, but the idea is they don't want you using keyers. They want you using something like a bug or straight key, or something that requires you to do something to produce individual bits and DAWs. But those you don't have to use, that's just what's required for getting their awards. You can still use the frequencies that they recommend. So on 20 meters, that's 14.050 plus or minus 10 kilohertz, or 14.114 plus or minus 10 kilohertz. On 40 meters, it's 7.055, again, plus or minus 10 kilohertz. And then there's a special one, which is 7.114, and that's the SKCC Elmer frequency that they have experienced operators listening to all the time. And if you send CQ on that plus or minus 10, you're going to get a response from someone you know is not going to get upset if you ask them to slow down. But that being said, don't be afraid to ask someone to repeat themselves or slow down. Most operators will be perfectly happy to do so. And I personally I think I've only had one time where somebody seemed to get a little upset if I asked them to slow down. So it's not intimidating. It's everybody out there, especially around these frequency ranges, is expecting beginners and slower QSOs. And SKCC, by the way, doesn't focus on speed. A lot of SKCC work is done between 10 and 15 words per minute. Okay, so this is the one that's probably going to scare people, and this is a partial example of a QSO. So the very beginning here, you have somebody listening and asking if the frequency is open. So they're sending QSO, question mark. Is somebody listening? Is somebody listening? And you have to listen really carefully, because CW has a 10x boost in how do I say this, performance versus phone, right? Because you're going to encounter a lot more QRP in the CW world, simply because it doesn't require as much power to get through. So yeah, listen carefully and send QSL a few times, and then once you're pretty sure it's open, go ahead and start send CQ. And this is just like you do in voice, but you're sending it in CW. And this particular pattern, when you start operating CW, you're gonna have dreams about this. So CQ, CQ. Yeah, CQ, CQ, DE, which is from, and then your call sign. So I use K7LED here, and then break at the end. So da 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 da. Then you're going to repeat your call sign again because any important information in CW you typically repeat at least once, and then you're going to send K at the end for break, and then you wait for somebody to respond to you. And at some point, somebody will come back. If they don't, you repeat your CQ. But they're going to come back and they're going to say your call sign from their call sign. So K7LED from W1AW. GM is a shorter. It's a not a pro sign, but it basically means good morning. Thanks for the call, and it's kind of using misspellings intentionally here, like kids do when they're texting. But it's all pretty phonetical. So good morning, thanks for the call. Your RST is 599 and then 5NN. And the NNs are what are called cut numbers. So the number sequences are fairly long. So 599 is dit, 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 and then 9 is da, 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 dit, da, 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 1, 2, 3, 4, dit, da, 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 dit, like that. So it takes a long time to send them. So when they repeat the RST sign, they oftentimes shorthand that using cut numbers. So they'll send 5, da, 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 and then they'll just send the letter N, dot it, dot it. Then they're sending their name, that the name is Marconi. And then the last phrase there is, okay, HW question mark, which is how copy. And then AR, which is basically saying that they're finished with this portion of the transmission. And then they're going to give your call sign from their call sign, and then K for break. And the response is going to be either your call sign from them, and then Roger Rogers or RR, and then you're going to say whatever you're going to say to respond, or they may use some shorthand. So if this person who's sending doesn't necessarily want to hear the whole sequence about their call sign from you, they might end this with a BK instead of a K, which means just continue the conversation. So you don't have to respond so formally at that point. You never have to, but that's typically inviting you not to. As a beginner operator, like a lot of people won't know that, and they'll just continue on using the formal model of it. And then at the end, they're actually ending the conversation. So it's K7LED from W1AW. Thanks for the QSO. OM is old man. CU AGN is see you again. 73. K7LED from WA1. Thank you. SK, which is basically out. And then typically they will respond with dit dit, and you respond with dit dit, and that's the end of the QSO. So this looks really intimidating, but it's not that bad. And they're written, you can actually find, like LICW, when you join that club, they give you a list of the exchange that is very typical, and you can just follow that, and you'll be just fine. So perfection. So outside of emergency communications, perfection is not required when copying CW. So just like listening to speech and reading, copying CW has room for some level of mistakes. Really, it's really just about getting the communication in context. You just want to understand what they're saying. You don't have to understand every character and every word. Everybody makes mistakes, and sometimes has to request people to repeat. There's band conditions and stuff like that get in the way too. So even the extreme experts running 35 words per minute, they also have to ask for repeats. It's the nature of the beast. So don't worry about having to do it. Okay, so once you've kind of mastered ICR and you've had your starting to have QSOs, then you can continue to increase your speed by reducing the Farnsworth spacing until you reach a true 20 words per minute. And at that point, you kind of start focusing on IWR, instant word recognition. And that's because at 20 words per minute, it gets to the point where you can no longer write down individual characters while you hear them coming through. Everybody's different, but it's right around 20 to 25 words per minute. You're going to notice that you start to recognize words without doing anything. Like you're going to start to recognize RST reports and Q codes and stuff like that without doing anything at all. They'll just start to jump out at you. But G4FON has some great example files that has all of the most common English words. It's got the Q codes and pro signs and stuff like that where you can practice instant word recognition to get you over that. I already mentioned this, but once you get past about 20 words per minute, you can no longer start to write down individual characters, and that's when head copying starts to become important. You've got to be able to, above 20 words per minute, you've got to be able to recognize words and stuff as they flow in and understand the context without writing them down. And this is part of the reason why a lot of people never get past that point, but you don't need to. Like a contest is going to be a standardized exchange, so you're going to get their name, you're going to get their RST report and stuff, but you don't need to be able to hear the rest of it at 35 words per minute or whatever else they're going to be sending at, whatever speed they're going to send at. All right, so here's a bunch of links for where to go from here. The Long Island CW Club is the first one. That's a club that I really love, that club, SKCC, that they organize awards and stuff and focus on manual keys. CW Ops, I didn't talk about them, but they have a great program called CW Academy that also runs courses and stuff like that. The difference is you have to register in advance and start from the beginning, whereas Long Island CW Club, it's all drop-in. You can drop in anytime for any of the levels and see if that's a good fit for you. Or they have classes that focus on sending and receiving. There's one of the really popular ones is called Good Fist, where you just over Zoom, you just start sending to their experts and they'll give you feedback and record it and let you hear yourself, and they'll put it in PCW Fist Check and show you, hey, you're swinging these DAWs and this is making it hard to copy, or you're so staccato, I can't hear your dits. And it's a great way to learn that stuff. And then I've got some pointers to keys. So the top one is Begali. The next one is W1SFR, who makes my Cootie. The government classic keys, these are super cool. This PV213. He makes them by hand out of England. They're also a Swedish pump design. And then CW Morse that I have these examples for up here. All right, so that's the end of my presentation today. So, thanks again.
All right, thanks, Jackson. We'll take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 11 o'clock. What? Oh, if anybody else hasn't signed in here locally, please do. Thank you.
And we are looking for people who are willing to do presentations. We've got the next couple meetings covered, but if you've got something interesting that you'd like to share, please put one together.
Jim, can he hear us on Zoom?
Yeah, we can put them up there.
Yeah, I'll post it after the meeting.
And there'll be a recording of it on YouTube too.